Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. If you're watching the live stream right now, just want to let you know I am actually in London at the ARC conference, so this is recorded. If you have any questions or super chats, always appreciate the support, but obviously we won't be able to respond to them today. Joining me today is somebody who I have been talking to on Twitter for a very long time, but have never got to speak with in person. We got talking a little bit about the administrative state, and we're going to talk about that, but really just kind of explore a lot of what's going on in the global political situation and the United States. He is Pascal-Emmanuel Gobry. He runs the PolicySphere podcast and news organization. Thanks for coming on, man.
Thanks, man. It's great to be here. Same back to you. I've loved your stuff for a very long time. Be looking forward to this for a very long time.
So for people who might not be familiar, maybe haven't seen your work on Twitter, what's your background? What do you do? How do you find yourself working in politics today?
Oh, man. Yeah. So first of all, the possibility that there's somebody who doesn't already follow me is sort of, I don't consider that to be a possibility. I am a Twitter niche micro celebrity. I am a French national, but I've been interested in American politics for a very long time. And so I started writing about it for various newspapers and organizations. Then I got a job at a think tank. And now I run this website called PolicySphere, which is sort of right-wing Politico, you could say. Politico for the good guys. We're not getting any USAID money.
I was going to say, how much are you on the take?
Right. Well, exactly. Well, that segues into our conversation about the administrative state, joking aside. And I also have a more general interest podcast, which is called the Sphere Podcast.
Excellent. All right. Well, people should definitely check out your work. Like I said, been enjoying your Twitter account for a very long time, and people should certainly follow in the odd chance that they may not currently, if they're like one of the 5 people, right, that have not followed. Now they have the opportunity. But the thing that started this possible conversation is you were responding to someone who had pointed out the idea that Adrian Vermeule and Patrick Deneen generally saw the administrative state as being, able to coexist. It jives with the possibility of the American founding. It's in the spirit of it. It could be part of this. Now, I found that interesting. I haven't specifically seen. I know that Vermeule feels that way. I haven't seen Deneen write a lot about this. I've read, 2 of his books, and I enjoy his work in general, but I'm not exhaustively familiar with everything that he's written. So
you've read only 2 of his books.
Only 2.
That's very high level.
Yeah.
Anyway, very 30,000 feet.
The point being, I have not seen their arguments specifically on this issue, other than Vermeule kind of talking about the possibility of Leviathan being used for good. But could you maybe lay out a little bit, general? You don't have to own their case, but a general idea of how they feel that this could work with the American founding and its principles?
So that's an interesting way of putting it. So obviously, I'm not speaking for either Vermeule or Deneen, neither of whom I've met, although I've corresponded with them, and we know people in common. But obviously, they speak for themselves. I don't speak for them. In terms of the relationship to between the American state and the American founding, I think that's very interesting, because I think that the American founding is actually a lot more complicated than either the sort. Obviously, the left-wing woke story we all know is false, but there's also a kind of normie con story where they were all like evangelical Christian conservatives from 1975, which is also not true. And in particular, if you look at the tension between Hamilton and Jefferson, I think Hamilton had a sort of very, frankly, imperial vision, or at least a sort of, muscular vision of the future America that he envisioned, which he envisioned as a sort of a much bigger nation than the 13 colonies, whether he envisaged it, going all the way to the Pacific. But he envisaged it as this sort of ambitious, hyper-modern, New York, financialized society. His own first idea for the Constitution was something a lot closer to the British Constitution, with essentially like the president as a king. and a sort of parliament that's kind of a watchdog and more, but really a very strong executive. And so, did all of the founding fathers want an administrative state? No, obviously, Jefferson was on the opposite end of the spectrum, and he had this sort of very sort of agrarian and so on vision. But like the idea that this is totally alien to the founding, that the founding fathers all wanted this sort of, agrarian, no government, quasi anarchy, where there's basically like 5 guys in Washington and nobody knows what they're doing and nobody cares. That's the only thing they envisaged. I don't think it's true historically. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that there is a huge problem. Like you said, obviously the left's narrative is wildly and comically bad, but the right's narrative is often very simplistic. It's the idea that the founders collectively
Right.
had a unified vision. If we
Right.
could just uncover the vision of the founders, then,
Right.
then we would know the direction in which the United States should move. And the tension between kind of the mercantile, urban, imperial side of the United States and its rural, agrarian, more anarchist understanding has basically been the story of the entire United States. I come from a
Exactly.
region
Yeah.
that was conquered is the proper word, and so we know
Where are you
we're
from?
very. I'm sorry, I'm from the South. So
Okay.
yeah, so the
Where?
war of northern aggression is still the way
The
it's
word
treated here.
northern
Yeah.
aggression.
And so we have an understanding. If you're not part of this kind of mainstream narrative, if you're part of the people who may have been reconstructed, you
Right.
know that you're not necessarily plugged into some unified understanding of the United States.
Right.
That actually
Right.
this has been whether it was the Whiskey Rebellion or every, the annulment crises, everything else that's gone through American history. There most certainly has not been this one vision of kind of
Right.
where the United States was going, which works to its advantage and its detriment. On one instance, it means we haven't had to have a large amount of official revolutions in the United States.
Right.
We kind of just pivot. France has got
Right.
its republics. We're like, no, it's just one republic the whole time. Like we just
Right.
kind of kept
Right.
the
Right. Right.
same thing going, even though we've radically changed the way
Right.
that the government operates.
It's like the famous South Park episode where the American thing is like everybody's got every opinion. That way we can pretend that we were always doing the same thing all along,
right,
or something like that.
Precisely. Yeah. So this idea that Americans often, especially conservative Americans, take of that there being a unified founding just doesn't quite hold up. And you can even see this. It's funny if you read like the Federalist Papers, you can see Hamilton fighting about like, well, no, you really do need to give you the control of your militias over to the United States government, the federal government, so that we don't have to have a standing army, because we all know how dangerous standing armies are. And then Hamilton's like, but we're definitely going to make a standing army, right? And like
Right.
so that's even inside the documents
Right.
in which they're kind of arguing for the current Constitution, we don't necessarily see a consistent understanding of kind of how
Right.
America is going to operate. So I think we can leave to the side this idea that it does or does not work with the specific spirit of the American founding, because
Right.
like you said, there are at least two and
Right.
probably many more which we could ascribe this to. So I guess the next question is, do we think that an administrative state is good, is a positive thing,
Right.
not just for America, but for countries in general?
Right. Right. Yeah. So that's the thing that sort of got me to respond to you, and then we decided to talk about it. Is you were sort of associating the idea of administrative state with sort of like imperial decline, and I don't think. I mean, I'm biased. I come from France. We're a country that was built by the administrative state, that invented, in a way, the administrative state. I mean, you have precedents with the medieval church, the Roman Empire, especially, but certainly the modern administrative state. And it's sort of it's a country that's sort of impossible to imagine without a strong government. So a couple of points I would make. One of the points that Vermeule makes, and that like sort of really changed my view on this, because I have friends on the other side of this, people like Yuval Levin and so on and so forth. The sort of the point that Vermeule makes is that the power of the administrative state was not stolen; it was given by Congress. So, and if you have a sort of like, it's condescending to say eighth grade level. That's not what I meant. But it's the sort of normie-con understanding of the Constitution is you don't need an administrative state because Congress makes those decisions. And what we've found under every party, every administration for over 100 years is that Congress doesn't want to make those decisions. Consistently, what it does is say, I'm going to, Congress, in order that these decisions be made, will hand a bit of my power to an agency or a bureau or whatever I'm going to create. And I'm going to say, there's going to be money to staff experts to make those decisions because Congress, don't want to make those decisions. And it's sort of, one of the great conservative or right wing or whatever virtues is to sort of acknowledge reality, right? Like every single time you gave Congress the power back, it's sort of like, maybe it should, but it won't, and it doesn't, and it never has in 100 years. And so, so you have all of these schemes, that conservatives come up with of, we're gonna defund this agency, or we're gonna streamline this, blah blah blah. It's like, okay, fine, but like at the end of the day, somebody's gonna decide, how to regulate some bit of the spectrum for the frequencies for 5G phones, right? Somebody's got to decide that, and Congress is going to say, I don't know. You know what I mean? 99% of the time. And so at the end of the day, some decisions have to be made about how we organize certain things. And at the end of the day, in every modern country that I'm aware of, these decisions are made by a class of people whose job it is to make those decisions, who are experts on those decisions. And there's nothing wrong with that. The problem comes when those people are unpatriotic, when they're sort of captured either by private interests or by an ideology like, wokeness or gay race communism or whatever you want to call it. But like the idea that there's a problem in and of itself, with having this, I just disagree. And it's not just that it's good, it's sort of necessary. The example with the standing military is very good. Like, if you're going to operate, if you live in a world where a military needs to have F-22s, you can't have a militia with guys who are doing this like 1 week in a month. You need professionals who like study special things to fly and maintain the plane, and that means that you need other professionals to sort of do the accounting and so on and so forth. And like, you can say, the Pentagon, it's very efficient, it's very inefficient, it should be reformed, it's corrupt, blah, 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 blah. But to say, we don't need anybody whose full-time job is to work on this stuff. We can just, citizens will do it part-time and whatever, and like Congress will make the decisions, and like, no, you don't. Like, if you want, if you want F-22s and like cruisers and like tanks, that implies a class of professionals whose job is to purchase, design, maintain, blah, 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 the tanks and the boats and the planes. And that implies an administrative state. And so it's true for military stuff. It's true for the civilian stuff.
So a couple things there. I'm with you that I think that formalization is a positive step in governance. I would just rather us say what is true and necessary and acknowledge the truth and necessity of those things, rather than put us through 9 steps of something that can't actually work, so that we're doing this kabuki theater about where power actually lies and where decisions are made. So to the extent that, every time we try to hand power back to Congress, they basically hand it back to administrators. It's a fair point, but at that point, the question is, why do we have Congress, right? Like, what's the? I mean, it sounds like a joke, but I'm not joking even a little bit. Like, if Congress is useless, if in the modern world it literally cannot operate a government and refuses to operate a government, then just cut it out, right? Like, just get rid of it. Like, it's unnecessary. Just have the executive appoint, the agencies that he needs to get this done. I don't understand why, if these people are entirely incapable of managing the responsibility handed to them, or in any way stemming the power of other agencies in which they should be the check on them, then there is literally no reason for them to exist. In addition to this, there's also the problem of you're of course correct that the maintenance of an F-22 requires a professional force. You can't just get your Minutemen together and have them run a fully involved carrier group. That's just not how that works. However, there's some key things that get changed when you shift to this mode of understanding and governance. You can't have a real republic that runs like this. Everyone from Aristotle to Machiavelli recognized that, like, military service is what makes you a citizen in a republic. This is also what the founders of the United States believed, which is the actual reason the Second Amendment exists, because you're not supposed to have a standing army. You are the standing army. That's what makes you a citizen. And so that's why things like the franchise expand infinitely, because we remove the only real requirement for being a real citizen. And so there's no reason that 16-year-olds from Guatemala shouldn't be voting in American elections, because nobody has to serve. Why? So what's the actual restriction? And so when we shift the nature of the military service, we actually fundamentally change something about the structure of the government and citizenship itself. And we actually make republicanism impossible. So we need to get rid of Congress and the idea that we're a republic in any real sense. Again, I'm not advocating for this one for another. I'm just saying these are the logical formalizations of the actual governance model we're advocating for. So if we're going to do this, let's not pussyfoot around about it, right? Let's just say what we're really doing. So what we're doing is we're shifting in what Gaetano Mosca called from a feudal society to a bureaucratic society. He said we're always oscillating between one of these two ends. And so the bureaucratic society is just going to have real fundamental differences in the way it can understand political power. And it comes with its own advantages and disadvantages. For instance, having the F-22 means we can maintain parity with China. It also means that we lose to goat herders in Afghanistan. Not directly, not because of the F-22, but the model of country that produces and maintains an F-22 loses to goat herders. Not because they can defeat F-22s, but they can defeat the kind of nation that models itself in a way that maintains F-22s. That's a cost that is not built into the raw military technology. Yeah, theoretically, we could murder everybody in Afghanistan with that F-22 if we wanted to. In reality, the kind of government that creates F-22 won't do that. And so therefore, you're in a situation where, yes, you have superior military technology, but you can't defeat inferior political forces with it because of exactly the type of politics you're practicing by creating that regime.
Right. So, I mean, so many things.
Yeah, there's
so
a lot there. Pick which one. Yeah.
So first of all, with enormous. So first of all, how red pilled are we allowed to be on this podcast if we're talking about getting rid of Congress within
I mean, obviously we're relatively red pilled at this point.
I mean, no. Well, so your first question was about the American founding, and so if we're trying to work within the existing American constitutional system, I don't think it's, and maybe that framework is just, it's been gone, since the War of Northern Aggression or since the New Deal or whatever, and we're never going to get it back, and we need Red Caesar and blah, blah, blah. Maybe that's true, but putting that aside, within the context of the American framework, such as it is today, I don't think it's crazy to say, look, Congress is going to set broad guidelines and sort of appropriate chunks of budget, and then the executive is gonna figure out the details. Essentially, that's not that may not be exactly what Washington and Jefferson had in mind, but it's also not, it's not the Death Star. Okay, so that's one point. Secondly, I mean, with enormous respect to the Italian school of political science, which is, I bow. Um, the idea that there's two categories of society, either feudal or bureaucratic, I just disagree with. I mean, those are certainly two categories that exist, but the idea that there's a clean separation, I think you have two fundamental questions, which is who has the guns and who has the money. And so in a feudal society, it's very clear who has the guns and it's very clear who has the money. It's the aristocratic caste. Uh in a bureaucratic society or in a non-feudal sort of advanced society that has a bureaucracy, that's the kind of distinction I would make. Having a bureaucracy doesn't necessarily mean that the bureaucracy sort of controls the country as a class, right? And so if you look at, for example, France in the early modern era, it had a bureaucracy, but it also had a sort of feudal system, but it also had a king. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't either or. It was this sort of complicated mix where you had aspects of a modern state, aspects of an ancient state. And I'm not saying, that should be the model that the US should go to. I'm just saying, the idea, if you accept that you're going to have a permanent bureaucracy, then automatically you become like this stagnant, late Chinese empire where everything is decided by some, person in an office who never sees sunlight, and there's no innovation and there's no vitality and blah, 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 blah. I just don't think that's true. I think that it's
Yeah, sorry,
just as if you have a standing army, it doesn't mean you're a military dictatorship. You know what I mean?
I should clarify that Mosca saw this as a continuum, not a binary. So
Right.
we're moving towards one or the other, but yes, you can clearly exist, in the middle, somewhere you may be closer to the feudal, closer to the bureaucracy. Right. These are the extreme ends you're going to be ending up in. Not, oh, well, the minute we have 3 bureaucrats, we've clicked over into late stage decline
Right.
empire. That's not exactly what he was presenting.
Okay. There. Okay. Well. That's good to know, because that was the impression I got from your tweet. Gotcha. That's the argument you were making, and I was like, no, like you don't actually. I mean, maybe sometimes societies just decline, right? And there's nothing you can do to stop it. I don't think that's necessarily true of America in the 21st century. I think. And maybe this can start off a sort of broader conversation about the right and the future of America in this new golden age where we're making America great again. What I would like the American right to understand, and I'm going to say this in my very arrogant French way, I'm explaining you how things are, is that, in a modern world where you have political enemies, using government can be good. And so I was just writing something about this, like Chris Rufo, who I admire, who's great, wrote this thing about dismantling the Department of Education, and he outlined how you do it, blah blah blah. And this is also good because I knew you used to be a teacher. Like, if the big idea is we block grant, and so currently the Department of Education says, if you want federal funding, obviously, education is the state, so you're not forced to take it, but in practice you're forced to take it. And if you do take it, then you have to agree to this and this and this and this. And conservatives want to block grant it, which means the government still writes states checks based on how many students they have, how many low-income students they have, and so forth. But there's no strings attached. And that means you can fire a bunch of bureaucrats. Okay, well, do you think that schools in California are going to stop teaching that, America is a racist, sexist hellhole because they get a block grant instead of a Department of Education mandate? No. I think that we should use the Department of Education to make the Californians teach their children correct things about American history, about the American founding. I think we should take the 1776 Commission report, which was this thing that Trump set up in his first term in response to the 1619 project, and just and say, if you want Department of Education money, you have to apply the 1776 Commission curriculum. And we're gonna have bureaucrats in the Department of Education that are going to make sure that you comply, and it's going to be their job, and they're going to live in Washington, D.C. and receive a government salary and go into a government office to do their government job, which there's nothing wrong with. You know what I mean? That's just one example and one among many.
So I want to be clear. I'm not allergic to power, which should be.
I know you
obvious.
aren't, which is why I wanted to have this discussion with you.
Yeah, so I'm not a libertarian, and I'm not even really a conservative in the sense of how government should be structured or how power should be wielded. I don't have a particular problem with power, but here's the way I think about it. You have basically three ways you can do this. Like, I'm with you that ultimately, if power exists, it's probably going to get used, and so it might as well be used for something good instead of something bad. So you have like three ways you can go about doing what we're talking about here. You can go kind of the way you're talking about, which is basically we need an anti-fascist crusade for wokeness, right? Like, we need a German style, we're erasing this alien ideology that perverted the state.
That's a good analogy, yeah.
Right. Like, if you want to make, like, sorry, but even bureaucrats aren't going to make California teach that America isn't racist unless they literally start throwing people in jail. Like, that's how you solve that problem. And it can be solved. We know that anti-fascist crusades work. One ran in the United States before it ever happened in Germany. Like, you can reconstruct people. Like, that can happen. But you need to be comfortable with the idea that you're going to be putting people in jail. If you need to send the 82nd Airborne to escort kids to school, then that's what you do. Like, you need to make peace with that is the way in which you're going to do it. And you need to not do it halfway. Like, half a revolution doesn't work. You either get it all root and branch or you don't do it all. So one option is to just reconstruct the libs, right? That's one option. The other, the next option is to try to do a kind of the Curtis Yarvin woo thing, right? Like, where we get enough of the dark elves together and they write the beautiful plays and television shows and books and everything that change the elite culture, and then this, trickles down and it just, you just charm everyone into this idea that, progressivism is dead. We don't need to have a reconstruction because you just recognize what is culturally ascendant and you move along with it. And to be clear, I don't think these are the hard three options. There's stages in between, but these are the three. And then the third one is you actually do real federalism and you just partition. Like, you actually just say, all right, California's in charge of California, Florida's in charge of Florida. And you actually, whether formally or informally, separate the amount of governance overlap as much as possible, and do what the founders did intend, which is for them to have this level of entertainment. I'll go on to the next point because I don't want to go on that forever. But what do you think about those options in the past that should be taken?
Yeah, I mean, so federalism doesn't work for the simple reason that everybody has to agree to it. And I used to tell this story in private. I'm going to tell it in public because it happened in public anyway. Before Chris Hayes was on MSNBC, you know who Chris Hayes is. I had, and this was during the Tea Party, I had this conversation with him and I said, well, look, why don't we do this? Like, and New York and California get to be super communist, and in exchange, Texas and, well, back then Florida was a purple state, but Texas and Alabama get to whatever. And I will never forget his response. He said, no, because it would mean that somewhere, someone in America would get paid less than minimum wage.
Right. He needs to conquer the world. His only solution is to conquer everybody and rule them.
Yes. And I thought, like, literally that, like, that's what's, that's the thing you're going to fight over. It's like someone somewhere might be paid less than minimum wage. Anyway, I thought that was so, you may not be, they're never going to let you just grow. You may not be interested in libs. The libs
They're
are
never gonna
interested in
leave
you.
you
So
alone.
federalism is dead. The Reconstruction option, I mean, I would be for it. Absolutely. I just don't think it's possible under the current regime. What I was thinking about, which is under the current regime, and I'm just going to coin a phrase, and you're in Europe, you can ask around about this, which is what I would call the Orban option, which is an option that respects the forms of a sort of liberal regime and actually respects them in the sense, it's not like Russia where the elections are completely fake, right? They're actual elections, and you can, they're real elections, and like nobody gets sent to jail for having the wrong political opinion, including, having accidents and things. Like, it's not true. Like, there's no political opposition in Hungary, like cowering, or, no Orban opponent is like afraid at night that the secret police is going to knock on his door. It's a real liberal regime in that sense. But it's also an illiberal regime in the sense that he has cultivated all these ecosystem of institutions in the way that the left has.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of help him get reelected and so on and so forth. Well, that's obvious, but also sort of steer the society in the right direction and ensure that things are healthy and so on. And I just, in terms of like a second Trump administration, we may or may not have a second regime and all of that, and we can fantasize about that or fear it or whatever. But in terms of, talking about or thinking through like what the people in DC should do now, what they should aim for in terms of something that's realistic but sort of accomplishes things, that's one option that I think about, and that I don't think gets thrown enough into the mix, because on the one hand we have the neocons, and on the other we have the sort of Caesar pilled people who, totally respect, but I don't think Trump is an American Caesar. So
no, I don't either. And what you're discussing right now is something of the soft Reconstruction option, right? It's somewhere between Yarvin and Reconstruction, where you're encouraging heavily people to choose the correct option through social incentives, some which are probably harder than Yarvin would necessarily suggest. He wants it to be all charm, and you're talking about, no, I want institutions, I want power wielded, I want people to be encouraged and incentivized to make these decisions, but I'm not looking to put them all in jail. Like, I'm not looking to outlaw the publications that talk about transing people, but I want the discussion of that to be so socially poisonous that anyone who would do it would just be immediately taken out of polite society just naturally without any kind of state action.
I mean, that's my difference with Curtis, and he has this analogy of the rocket. In order to put a rocket in orbit, every single thing has to go right, and if one thing goes wrong, it's the same as if everything goes wrong. And so it's either all or nothing, and so I disagree with him on that. I think there's a spectrum of options, and I think there's some options I don't like, such as the sort of normie conservative, but I think there's a menu of options over there, many of which are realistic. And so that's going back to the discussion about whether an administrative state is good. I mean, that's a good critical, like, let's put serious lawyers on our side and serious sort of bureaucrats on our side, staff the Department of Education, and tell them, use whatever current law, resources, budgets, obligations, tools you have to try to get, and as you put it, like, it may be impossible to get California to change without the 82nd Airborne. But, before we send the 82nd Airborne, we can already try,
If
you
nothing
know?
else, it gives us the rationale, the casus belli as to why they have to go.
Right.
Right.
And then afterwards you're like,
look,
all right,
we've
well,
done
we tried
everything we
everything, so this is
can.
on
Yeah.
you, right?
Yeah,
It's
these
like,
rebellious Californians, their treacherous ways have simply defied repeatedly
yeah.
our softer attempts to encourage them to move in the correct direction. Yeah, no,
Yeah, we're gonna appoint Tucker Carlson as carpetbagger governor of California.
That's right. He's the radical Republican, but in the actual sense this time. So I would agree with a lot of that. Look, Yarvin has softened his stance on this. He's come out, he came out with that essay, a couple weeks ago about how he apologized to Rufo, and actually it does look like Trump is going to be able to make some headway. Ultimately, he's still kind of hedging his bets on the ability to completely reform the state, but he backed off his hard line. There is no incrementalism. There's only the switch, and so I think that is an interesting development. And I want to be clear, practically we're aligned. Like in practical politics here, you and I have the same prescription, right? Like the Leviathan exists, whether I like it or not at this moment, whether it's good or not at this moment. And so while it exists, it needs to be used for good. It's not going to sit there neutral. It's not like, oh, if I don't touch the gun, then the gun doesn't exist. I'm not operating in that fantasy land. I'm not a conservative in that way. And so I'm with you that to the extent that it exists, you need to be using it for your benefit. I'm not arguing against political action here. I'm not for neutrality. I'm not the government and its power scares me. Like that is not my argument here. The thing I want us to think about, and again, this could just be inevitable. Like you said, civilizations just fall. So this could just be this is the morphology. Like this is the way we go. There's nothing, there's nothing here but to do the best we can in these moments, in these times. However, because this is a hobby horse of mine, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about and trying to understand this issue, it is something that I at least want the conversation to be had about, even if at the end of the conversation, the answer is simply, well, this is the way that the world works. This is the way that political realities move, and therefore we can't take any action on this. I do want us to think about the fact that there is a specific logic to bureaucracies. And really, you pointed this out with France, and it's an important distinction here, right? Again, one of the core things about from Italian elite theory, from Italian political theory, is the iron law of oligarchy, right? It's going to exist. Anyone who says organization is saying oligarchy. That's just the case. So there's going to be some level of this. I am fully acknowledging that. The thing that Mosca in particular warns about is when we move from that situation which you were talking about, where you have the nobility and you have the king and you have the church and you have the bureaucracy and you have the merchant class and you have the peasant, like you have all these different influences, all these different social spheres, and each one of them accrues power and influence in different ways. The way that the church accrues influence is fundamentally different from the way that the king or the nobility or the bureaucracy acquire these powers, right? And the thing he warns about, the reason he said the America had become a true oligarchy, was that all of these spheres had been collapsed, and that there was only one way to actually or operate an organization. It's that everything became a bureaucracy. It's not that the existence of bureaucracy itself is the end, but once everything becomes bureaucracy, then you've got no fire breaks, right? Everything just rolls through, because all of the ways that your business, your church, your government, your neighborhood watch, everything operates exactly the same way. And so once the poison gets dropped into one, the head of the bureaucracy, it just runs through the whole thing. And so the thing I really want, and again, I understand this is a much longer ask, but the thing I want us to think about in America while we're doing this is, yes, I want the Leviathan aimed the right direction since it exists. But while we have this power, I also want to re-empower, I want to give different structures to these community and regional
Right.
organizations. I want them to gain their ability to organize in a different way so that next time the left has a hold of this monster's tail, not that, oh, we got to get rid of it because once you build something, the other guy is going to build. I'm not doing that. But once we have more robust communities and we have organizations that organize in fundamentally different ways and draw their power base in different ways, we create a situation in which we are less likely to see wokeness just burn through a civilization like we saw it. That is really what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I mean, I fundamentally my sort of political perspective is the political perspective of like the French medieval aristocracy or the French aristocracy circa 16 something. Uh and you described it perfectly, which is that this society, which is really the matrix from which the rest, every other, this sort of like turn of the millennium European society, everything else that is Western came from that, right? um uh it was a society that had these different groups in a sort of hierarchical order. um and so none of them were dominant. Sovereign is he who decides the exception, right? The king was the head, the summit of the pyramid. And so if there was a clash of sort of perspectives, the king could sort of hand down the decision. And so it wasn't the kind of checks and balances a la the US Constitution, but it was also much more complex and sort of much more responsive and less, and not at all tyrannical, actually, in the way we mean of tyrannical with sort of brute arbitrary power. Um, and so this idea that there needs to be several orders in society, several different kind of power centers or influence centers, and it's not just an organic it's not just a legal separation in the sense of, oh, there's the legislative, the executive, the judiciary. It's a sort of sociological and even spiritual separation, in the sense that the church, the merchant class, the warriors, the bureaucrats, and so on and so forth, they didn't go to the same schools. They, I mean, they share deep sort of Christian principles, patriotism, but they have different worldviews. They come from different places. And so they're actually different, right? That's the problem with American society is you have, in theory, you have, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, DC, New York. In theory, these could all be different power centers, except they're all run by the same people who went to the same schools and went to the same private schools. And therefore, it's this kind of like, unified Borg. Even though one of the greatest things about America is that it's this giant nation the size of a continent. And so historically, it's been the best at developing these sort of rival power centers, distinct cultures and subcultures that were, New York interest versus Chicago versus the South versus the West. And they were debating, and they were all proud Americans, but had different, a rancher from the Mountain West had a different perspective from a New York banker, and blah, blah, blah. And that was what worked. And so, to your point, how do you, once we get rid of the left in one way or another, and I'm not saying necessarily helicopters, but like let's imagine a better
physical
future
relocation. Yeah.
where the left is not viable as a political or cultural force. Let's put it that way.
Reconstructed. We'll stick with our reconstructed.
Yes. I mean, there's a prudential argument for federalism, right? The best argument for federalism is practical. It's just like, as a fan of bureaucracy, I will admit, like, it's very difficult to run a continent-sized nation of 350 million people from one city.
Yes.
It just is.
Yes.
And so the sort of practical argument for saying, all right, well, now that we have sort of calmer politics, that we're not in this sort of existential struggle for the soul of America and the future of civilization and debating, whether we're going to castrate children or what have you. We're now among adults. We can have grown up discussions about grown up things. Well, of course, there's a ton of things that it makes more sense to be decided in Austin and Tallahassee and Sacramento than DC, because they aren't bound up right in those other debates, right? The reason the left wanted to increase the power of federal government is because they wanted to use it to impose it on other people.
Right.
The reason the Republicans wanted to maintain states' rights was because they didn't want these impositions. And so, in that way, the idea of saying, well, of course, state control, local control, they're very good things. It's just, what I disagree with, and I understand you weren't making this point. I'm just saying, that's the better argument for it. Instead of saying, oh, local control is the way we get out of the thing. No, it isn't. But it's still a good idea. And it's a much more natural and easy idea once you've sort of removed existential stakes from the politics. It becomes much more natural to say, well, of course, yeah, we're going to run the school locally. I mean, why wouldn't we?
One of the things that I think poses a particular problem for the United States really is its doctrine of equality in this area, right? Like, it's hard to form social spheres that are distinct without some level of understanding of hierarchy. And in the United States, we never had, obviously, a formal church. We never had an ancien regime, but the way we got around that was specifically what you were talking about, which was regionalism, right? The way that we broke up the spheres was geography instead of class, or that kind of thing. And that worked until we got the train and the telegraph and then the radio and the TV, and then all of a sudden you could rule the whole continent from one place instead of having to have all these different. As soon as the intermediate institutions became unnecessary for the government's maintenance of the state, they all atrophied, right? And so that kind of fell into disrepair, and everything just kind of became this one gray goo across all of the United States. And so technology is a problem for our regionalistic solution here. But interestingly, I don't know. Have you read any Gilles Deleuze?
I've never read an entire book.
I don't blame you. It's awful. But I mean, the ideas are interesting.
They were the worst generation in terms of I'm just talking about the quality of the writing. Like, even putting aside their opinions, they're terrible.
Yeah,
it's not the translation. Let me assure you.
Yeah, if you're reading Anti-Oedipus, you kind of just want to drop your brain into a blender. But I will say this about Deleuze: his concept of deterritorialization and reterritorialization, I think, is particularly useful, because the idea here is basically all of these non-bureaucratic, non-market-based domains, like the spiritual, the aristocratic, the martial, these things, were basically dissolved. Everything that was kept in those domains was deterritorialized and reterritorialized into the market, which is why your average megachurch runs more like a business than it does a church. That's why your government runs more like a business than a government. Your military is elevating people who can give TED Talks instead of people who can lead warriors. Like, all of these different classes that were kind of kept over from the older regimes and echoed in the American experience have been hollowed out and reterritorialized in this in this way. And what that's done is allowed for, again, the management of an entire continent efficiently and better bureaucracy. But again, it's brought us to this Mosca point where everything is lined up exactly the same way. It all runs exactly the same way. And so I wonder, can America change this system, change this reality about the administrative state and bureaucratic government without radically changing the structure, because it no longer can insulate itself with just the geographic distance and difference?
That's a very good observation. I mean, one immediate answer which is only a partial answer, but I think it's a big deal, is America no longer has freedom of association. And if you restore freedom of association, you're already like enabling a lot of new things, new spaces to be created, and different. I mean, this is, Tocqueville's observation about America, like two observations about America. First of all, Americans talk a lot about liberty and freedom, but really they're the nation of equality. And like the Central American idea to Tocqueville is not liberty, it's equality.
Right.
And number two, and this is a very normie con cliche, but it's true. It's a nation of joiners. It's a nation of free associations, and so on and so forth. Like it really is something that's natural to you guys, and it's something that all of us admire about American life. And it's very, very degraded now relative to where it was in the 50s and in the 1900s, and I'm sure in the 1850s. But it could return, right? If you, I was going to say, if you reduce the size of
But you see
if
my
you
point
reduce
here.
the size
You're
of
following
government
my
in the right
logic.
way, if you detoxify
Yeah.
politics, if you restore freedom of association, I think that you will see a lot of. I'm sounding so normie. I think you
Yeah.
will see a lot of little platoons. I think churches will become more important to social
Right.
life, and so on and so forth.
Well,
I know
he's
that's
just
only a partial solution to the problem you're describing, which is totally real. But it's not nothing.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair to the normicons, like de Tocqueville specifically said that the problem that association building in America solves is our individualism, right? Like,
Right.
like this is all the normicons talk about the little platoons and the associations, and they never talk about the fact that de Tocqueville was saying that they were the solution to individualism, which is a rampant
Right.
problem in the United States. And so the way that you solve this is, but as you're saying, free association is critical to this. And I'm 100% on board with you. Like, free association being returned to Americans would be a radical change, but that radical change first would be described as Nazism. Like, it's gonna be
Yeah.
treated as if you're trying to bring the Third Reich. But also, it naturally produces a disunified, debureaucratic, I don't know the proper word to use here, but anyway, it reduces the chance that you could have a unified bureaucracy, because the freedom of association necessarily creates particularities that makes it difficult to manage large blocks of people. And that's why one of the many reasons free association had to be destroyed, because you have to turn, you have to destroy the middle class. You have to destroy all of these associations that were bolstering American communities, but holding down centralization across the American empire. And so by reintroducing that free association, you're necessarily going to break down the ability to wield large amounts of unified power across the entire homogenous culture, because it's particularized again.
Right.
Which
Right.
I'm entirely in favor of. But this is what I talk about. This is what I mean when I talk about this. I'm not allergic to power in theory.
Right.
I'm trying to reinstantiate an order that is more organic in its
Right.
desire to have multiple forces that check the excesses of bureaucracy, rather than necessarily being like, oh no, government power itself is the problem.
Right. Right. And so on the bureaucracy, I mean, again, like there's a Laffer curve to bureaucracy. If we're gonna check off normicon concept, there's a Laffer curve to bureaucracy. So, it's possible to have too much bureaucracy, and if the bureaucracy starts to sort of suffocate, which is absolutely like a risk, a perennial problem, and one that needs to be managed, just like uranium. Right? Uranium is always going to be radioactive, but it's still a very good source of power, and you can manage it. With regard to free association, I mean, I just disagree with your history of it, and this is a much broader conversation, but I think that the end of free association in America is like 100% about race, or 97% about race.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. But
And then it was sort of leveraged by, especially feminists and in general by the administrative state to sort of like make life difficult for everybody and sort of break down these sort of um, abilities by communities and so on to self-organize and therefore be less controllable. But fundamentally, it was about the sort of Reconstruction 2.0 of the 60s. And
But we're kind of
so
saying the same thing here, right? Like whether you feel like that's the impetus or not, the result is once you dissolve these particular communities about along whichever lines they're
right.
organized, that's the revolution necessary then for the state to centralize the power that's then freed up by that destruction of association.
Yeah, well, the point I'm making is that there's no necessary conflict between free association and bureaucracy, right? There can be a kind of balance, right? I don't. I'm trying to find an example of that's not in the American context of uh. Well, I mean, there's a very famous example, which is, I mean, I'm sort of making your point here, but in the French Revolution, um, I mean, they banned private associations, right? The
Right.
French Revolution banned the guilds and so on and so forth, and that was very much a kind of a liberalization that also made the sort of the power of the administrative state possible and sort of removed barriers to the administrative state. So I guess I'm hoisted on my own petard right now. I
If the example you reached for is the one which reinforces my point,
I'm talking myself into agreeing with you, which
I
is a great demonstration of open mindedness and
yes, not going to stop you in the
uh
slightest.
yeah. I mean, no, you. I mean, yeah, I agree. Like, I agree. There's always a tension between the sort of bureaucratic center and the sort of bottom up free association kind of thing. I just that's just one of the tensions that has to be managed in life. Just like, the tension between man and woman, the tension between boss and worker. You know what I mean? Uh, and the idea that it has to be one or the other, or if you have one, then you have to kill the other. um I just don't think so.
Yeah, again, I think that and there might be, and I said this from the beginning of our discussion, even on Twitter, is it might be the truth that simply bureaucracy is a reality of the modern world and that its consequences are inescapable, and this is just the direction that all modern states have to go down. I'm not ruling that out. Like
Right.
I'm not entirely a determinist, but I'm more comfortable with the idea of fate than most, I suppose. And if this is the manner in which all societies move and our society is one of many societies, then this might end up just being the manner in which we move. But in the meantime, as you're saying, this doesn't have there's a continuum here. We're not it's not a binary. We're not stuck one or the other. And
Right.
so if there are healthier versions of this path, if we can moderate this in some way, if
Yeah.
we can achieve a certain level of balance at some level, then I think that's ultimately what we should be doing. So I
Yeah.
know that we wanted to keep this about an hour, so let's go ahead and start wrapping this up. But before we go, where can people find your work? Is there anything you want to point them to?
Sure. So my Twitter is at @pgobry_en. That's very easy to say. I have a website which is a political news, policy focused news website called PolicySphere. It's for sort of very policy focused people, and I have a sort of more general interest podcast which is called the Sphere Podcast.
Excellent. All right, guys. Well, like I said, make sure to check him out, especially on Twitter. I can definitely recommend his work there. And of course, if it's your first time on this channel, make sure that you subscribe, click the bell notifications so you know when the streams go live. If you'd like to get the broadcasts as podcasts, make sure you subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast network. And if you'd like to pick up my book, which discusses many of these issues in detail, The Total State, you can do that both in print and an audio book. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, all of that stuff. Once again, sorry guys, this one isn't live, so we can't answer any of your questions if you have them in there, but really appreciate you coming by. And as always, I will talk to you next time.